Top 6 youngest child brides ever married to medieval kings. A royal mother casually kicks her own flesh-and-blood daughter out of the picture to go ahead and marry the groom herself. And a child queen clutches her pregnant belly, sleeping absolutely soundly, while her husband is being brutally castrated and thrown straight out of a high tower window to the ground, in the very next room. Do you think that is just some cheap, sensational script from Netflix? No. That is the 100% true reality of European royalty. A dark place where little girls, barely 2 years old, were kidnapped by armed knights in the dead of night to become betrothed wives. See, a place where the fragile life of a 7-year-old child was priced exactly like a high-risk financial insurance contract. There is absolutely no fairy tale magic to be found here. Only 12-year-old bodies permanently destroyed on the birthing bed, just to push out more bloodthirsty kings. In this video, I am going to reveal to you the secrets behind the 6 darkest files concerning the sacrificial brides of the crown. Stay with me until the very last minute, and you will know exactly how the great Tudor dynasty of England actually originated from a truly horrifying assault, and exactly how these young girls transformed into vicious villainesses to overthrow the throne. Don't forget to hit subscribe and like the channel, and so we can continue to accompany each other in many future videos. Number 1. Margaret of Habsburg, the child hostage, the husband-killing curse, and the vengeance carved on a tombstone. The year was 1483. European history has always been written in the blood of warriors on the battlefield, but equally brutal wars took place right inside royal bedrooms, where the victims were children who couldn't even speak in full sentences yet. In a warm room lined with sheepskin rugs within the kingdom of the Habsburg dynasty, little Princess Margaret, just 3 years old at the time, was sound asleep. She was just a chubby toddler, still smelling of mother's milk, completely unaware of how heavily the name Habsburg weighed upon her tiny back. And then, the silence of the night was ripped apart. Strange men, wearing cloaks embroidered with the crest of the French kingdom, stormed into the room. They violently shoved aside the bitterly weeping wet nurses, snatched up the bewildered, screaming 3-year-old child, and charged straight out into the freezing night. Do you think this was some anonymous kidnapping for ransom? No. In reality, this was a fully sanctioned betrothal ritual. King Louis XI of France, a cunning old fox of politics, had forced Margaret's father, Maximilian I, to sign the Treaty of Arras. And the most vicious clause to guarantee peace was this: hand over his 3-year-old daughter to be the betrothed wife of Dauphin Charles of France, living as a political hostage to keep the Habsburgs in a chokehold. The little girl was not allowed to cry and bid her father farewell, nor was she allowed one last look at her mother. Margaret was dragged onto a violently shaking carriage, hurtling toward the French border like an urgent tribute. For the next 6 agonizing years, that child's youth was entirely stripped away. She was not allowed to live as a human being. Instead, she was molded to become a statue of a queen. The noble women of the French court surrounded her day and night. They brainwashed her, taught her how to walk without making a sound, how to smile with just enough pride yet remain obediently submissive. Margaret was forbidden to speak her mother tongue, forced to forget her family roots. Her fragile mind was indoctrinated with an ironclad belief, ingrained into her very flesh and blood. I am French. I was born to be Charles's wife. I am the future queen. But politics has no room for humanity. 6 years of house arrest and molding ended with a bone-chilling splash of cold water. When Margaret was just 9 years old, an age where one barely begins to understand the world, the French king suddenly flipped the script. Political interests had shifted. The Kingdom of Brittany was now a much fatter, more lucrative piece of meat. And so, Charles VIII needed to marry Anne of Brittany to annex her territory. They coldly stripped Margaret of all her titles. Those who just yesterday knelt and called her queen now looked at her like a piece of trash. They packed up the 9-year-old girl along with a few trunks of old clothes and shoved her onto a humiliating carriage ride, returning her to the manufacturer. 6 years of being brainwashed, a child's youth thrown away like a dirty rag after the political feast had been cleared from the table. In modern times, such psychological shock, abandonment, and betrayal at that age would be enough for a child to need lifelong therapy. But for Margaret, that was merely the appetizer for a bloody banquet called marriage. The Habsburgs did not raise useless people. The daughter returned by France was quickly cleaned up, psychologically refurbished, forced to forget her humiliation, and sold off to another prospect, Juan, Prince of Asturias of Spain. This time, the marriage actually happened. Margaret had turned 17, the most radiant and vibrant age of a young woman. Spain was warm and sunny, and her young husband Juan seemed truly infatuated with her beauty. One might think that after the rain comes the rainbow, or that the deeply traumatized child had finally found a peaceful harbor. But the curse of the crown began to manifest itself in the cruelest way. A mere 6 months after their lavish wedding, the radiant Prince Juan suddenly dropped dead. The Spanish royal court was shaken to its core. And do you know the official reason recorded by the royal physicians and spread among the commoners? They ruthlessly concluded that the young prince had died from overexertion due to excessive marital duties. Yes, a conclusion that might sound like a boastful triumph of masculinity, but was in fact an invisible poison-tipped dagger aimed straight at Margaret. From a grieving widow, she was turned into a sinner. "Oh," people whispered behind her back, casting disgusted glares her way, calling this foreign princess a life-sucking monster, a demonic fox spirit carrying a death curse. Margaret was widowed for the first time at 17, isolated in a foreign land, carrying Juan's flesh and blood in her womb. But tragedy wasn't done with her. The only child that gave her a shred of hope to keep living was born into silence. The baby no longer had a heartbeat. Before she could even finish mourning her husband, 4 years later, the pawn named Margaret was picked up again and placed into the hands of Philibert II, Duke of Savoy. That woman's heart must have turned to stone by then. Ooh, she closed her eyes and blindly stepped into her third marriage. This time, married life lasted for 3 years. Philibert was an avid hunter, a thrill-seeker. One day, after a sweating, exhausting hunt on a sweltering summer day, he chugged a freezing cold cup of water, fell terribly ill, and died shortly after. That year, Margaret hadn't even crossed the age of 25. Try closing your eyes and putting yourself in this woman's shoes. Kidnapped at 3 to be a placeholder wife. Humiliatingly discarded at 9. Branded a husband-killing witch at 17 because her husband died in bed, losing her firstborn child in the process. Widowed for a second time at 24 over a ridiculous reason caused by her new husband. If it were anyone else, they might have shaved their head and become a nun, or gone mad and thrown themselves from a high tower into a freezing moat to end a life treated like political garbage. But not Margaret. Amidst the ultimate agony and the mockery of fate, she chose to use a dark, half-smile to strike back at this rotten world. She flat out refused any subsequent marriages, cut off her own long hair, locked her heart away, and became a fiercely powerful female regent and politician. Her revenge wasn't loud with swords and spears, it was razor-sharp with words. She personally penned a poem, demanding it be carved onto her own tombstone, a poem that, even today, makes historians shiver at its supreme irony, bitterness, and brilliance. Si giste Margot, la gentille damoiselle, qu'à deux maris et encore épouselle. Here lies Margaret, the willing bride / twice married, yet died a virgin. Two short lines, yet a stinging slap delivered straight to the face of the entire European child marriage political system. The 6-year betrothal to the French king was nothing but a paper fraud. The second marriage ended in suspicious death, and the third evaporated like a sick joke. She called herself the willing bride, a blood-curdling sarcasm because, in her entire life, she never had the right to say no, to tossed onto the beds of strange men, only for the ultimate consummation to be a complete lie. That self-mockery wasn't a cry, it was a chilling laugh, the ultimate disdain of someone who had seen through the utter cheapness of so-called royal privilege. Number 2. Isabella of Valois, the insurance contract and the doll furniture in the dungeon. If Margaret's story left you suffocating at the irony of fate, then brace yourself to step into the England of 1396, where cruelty wasn't just empty promises, it was calculated, cold-blooded down to the exact digits, down to the very toys of a little girl. The backdrop was the devastating 100 Years' War between England and France. Both kingdoms were exhausted. On the corpses of soldiers piled high at the borders, the stench of death rising to the heavens. King Richard II of England, 29 years old at the time, was recently widowed. The national treasury was drained, and domestic lords were plotting rebellion. Richard was standing on the edge of an abyss. He desperately craved two things: a temporary peace treaty with France to free his hands for internal enemies, and a massive pile of cold, hard cash. The perfect solution was presented by his courtiers: marry a French princess. The only problem was, the chosen princess, Isabella of Valois, was exactly 5 days away from turning 7 years old. But for royalty, age was just a soulless number, while gold and silver were the absolute truth. The wedding was staged in a pompous and grotesque manner. On October 31st, 1396, a 29-year-old grown man led a child, who hadn't even lost all her baby teeth, into the cathedral. They draped over that tiny, fragile body a heavy velvet cloak adorned with pearls, so crushingly heavy she couldn't stand straight and had to be lifted by the armpits to walk. The candlelight cast shadows on Isabella's bewildered, fear-pale face. When informed she was to become the queen of a strange kingdom, the only question that 7-year-old child managed to utter to her wet nurse was, "Will I be allowed to bring my dolls?" Yet, the most horrifying and haunting aspect of this marriage didn't lie in that staggering age gap, but in a yellowed sheepskin ledger, the English royal inventory. Normally, when a queen consort enters the court, the dowry assets consist of chests of fine silks, ruby jewelry, or land deeds. But when the high officials of England stood to inventory the assets of the soon-to-be 7-year-old Queen Isabella, they had to solemnly use their quill pens to record into the national ledger an incredibly heartbreaking and bizarre catalogue. A collection of rag dolls, accompanied by a miniature bedroom furniture set, intricately carved entirely from solid silver. Take a second to imagine that image. In the cold, a gloomy stone chambers of the Tower of London or Windsor Castle, reeking of political scheming and bloody executions, the Supreme Queen Consort of England was sitting on a woolen rug. Her tiny hands biting her lip in concentration, carefully arranging each little silver chair and silver bed for her lifeless dolls. Those dolls were her only friends, the absolute last shred of humanity and childhood locked away alongside the grand title of Mother of the Nation. They were the cruelest testament to the fact that the blood-soaked crown had been brutally hammered onto the head of a child. And if you think those silver toys were King Richard's extravagant pampering, you are dead wrong. Look at their money-drenched marriage contract. Pretor. King Richard II did not view Isabella as a wife, nor as a child needing protection. He looked at her exactly the way a capitalist looks at a high-risk life insurance policy. In an era where child mortality from disease was staggeringly high, the English court forced the French to sign an unimaginably cold clause, completely stripping Isabella of her human value. They explicitly stipulated the dowry accompanying the bride was 800,000 gold francs, a colossal sum. If Queen Isabella unfortunately died before reaching the age of 13, the legal age to consummate a marriage and bear children, King Richard would not have to return a single penny of that massive dowry. Alive, she was a peacekeeping shield. Dead, and she was a cash payout for her husband. The little girl's life was priced exactly in cold, hard francs. But the wheel of fate always takes cruel turns, crushing those who scheme. King Richard II, the man who calculated every penny upon the life of his child bride, didn't live long enough to spend that money. In 1399, he was overthrown by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Richard was stripped of his crown, thrown into a dungeon at Pontefract Castle, and starved to death. The Kingdom of England changed hands. Isabella, now exactly 10 years old, suddenly became a widow. Once again, the little girl was trapped in the demonic vortex of power struggles. The new King of England flipped his stance. He forbade her from returning to France, confiscated all her jewelry, stole even her silver toy sets, and plotted to force her to marry his own son to continue legitimizing the seizure of the dowry. But Isabella, despite being only 10, had tasted enough of the bitter poison of captivity. The proud blood of the French royal house awakened. She refused to compromise. That 10-year-old child wore a pitch-black mourning dress, adamantly rejecting all arrangements, even going on a hunger strike in protest. A child's stubbornness gave the English king a massive headache. Finally, unwilling to shoulder more diplomatic trouble, and the English court spat in the face of the French royals by tossing the 12-year-old girl onto a ship, returning her to her homeland as an empty-handed widow, without returning a single franc of the dowry. Arriving back in her homeland, one would think the nightmare of a child marriage victim had finally ended. One would think that growing up, Isabella would finally have the right to dictate her own life. But the twisted irony of the European royal playbook never lets its pawns go. In 1406, Isabella turned 16. she had blossomed into a beautiful young woman, her eyes harboring the sharpness of someone who had walked through the hellish prisons of England. Right at this moment, the French royal family, her own flesh and blood, reached out their cruel hands, forcing her to walk down the aisle once again for family interests. And who was the groom this time? It was her own biological cousin, Charles of Orléans, who was merely 11 years old. Look at this demonic arrangement. The child who was once sold to a 29-year-old man, upon growing up, was now forced to marry a boy still wet behind the ears. From the role of a helpless victim, she was transformed into a manipulator, forced to play the adult protector in a grotesque political marriage orchestrated by her own family. She didn't cry, nor did she resist anymore. Perhaps at 16, Isabella's heart had long since turned to stone. She quietly played the wife to a boy, quietly became a mother, and ultimately, quietly took her last breath on the birthing bed in 1409, at only 19 years old. The child born survived, but the mother's life was violently snatched away in ultimate agony. An entire short life of less than 2 decades, Isabella of Valois never lived a single day for herself. She was just a flesh and blood doll, tossed back and forth across the English Channel, and when she broke, she was permanently discarded into the cold earth. Number 3. Joan I of Naples, the Christmas Eve bedroom murder, and the cold smile of a pregnant woman. Let's rewind time to a glorious day at the magnificent Palace of Naples. King Robert the Wise was battling a thorny political dilemma regarding succession. And as was the toxic, deep-rooted habit of European royalty, the solution was to shove 2 children into the same marriage cage to extinguish a war. This time, it was Princess Jeanne, 7 years old, heir to the throne of Naples, and Prince Andrew from the Kingdom of Hungary, a mere 6 years old. Can you picture what a wedding between 2 kids still wiping their noses would look like? They were probably busy fighting over a piece of cake or a toy at their own wedding feast. They grew up together in the same castle, eating at the same table. But instead of becoming childhood sweethearts and protecting each other amidst the treacherous royal court, they were molded by 2 hostile political factions. The wet nurses and the high lords whispered toxic schemes into their ears every day, sowing seeds of paranoia into the minds of the 2 children. Time passed, and the 2 innocent kids of the past had reached adulthood. And this is when the tragedy truly bared its fangs. Andrew, backed by the mighty Hungarian royalty behind him, was unwilling to just be a puppet prince consort, fading into the background behind his wife. He craved power, wanted to wear the crown, wanted to be the true ruling king of the prosperous Naples. And Joan? The little 7-year-old princess forced into marriage had shed her skin to become a born queen, sharp, intensely ambitious, fiercely proud, and worshipped by the entire Neapolitan court. The blood of rulers flowed in her veins. She would rather die than share her supreme power with a crude foreign husband who was constantly plotting to usurp her family's throne. Their forced marriage devolved from an awkward arrangement into a dark, subterranean battlefield. The majestic Palace of Naples became a suffocating cage where every meal could be poisoned, where every shadow cast on the wall could be a lurking assassin. And then, the deadly Christmas Eve of 1345 struck. It was a freezing winter night, with the church bells tolled, but the wind from the Mediterranean Sea howled through the stone watchtowers of the castle like a wailing dirge. The atmosphere was eerily silent. Andrew, the young prince consort, was getting ready for bed when suddenly someone knocked on his door with an urgent message. Half asleep, he stepped out into the dimly lit corridor. In just the blink of an eye, the darkness permanently swallowed him whole. A group of masked assassins lunged from the shadows. Before Andrew could even let out a full cry for help, he was violently pinned to the freezing stone floor. The killers didn't use swords or daggers to finish him off quickly or cleanly. No, they wanted a highly symbolic death, the ultimate humiliation for a man who dared to demand to be king, who dared to challenge the Queen's power. According to the bone-chilling records of contemporary historians, they pulled out a rough rope, wrapped it tightly around Andrew's neck, and strangled him until his face turned purple and his eyes rolled back in terror. But far more sickening, the other end of the rope was brutally tied tight to the young prince's genitals. Do you feel a chill down your spine? This act wasn't just murder. It was the total annihilation of his masculinity, entirely stripping away the male authority that Andrew had always proudly brandished to assert dominance. Sit. Amidst the choked screams dying in his throat and the sickening crunch of cartilage, the battered body of the Hungarian prince was hoisted up by the assassins and thrown straight out the window. His body hung suspended, swinging in the bottomless night, violently smashing against the cold stone wall outside the castle before plummeting to the blood-stained snow below. But this entire barbaric execution still wasn't the most terrifying part. The plot twist that continues to make historians shiver to this day was Queen Joan's location on that very night. While her husband was thrashing in absolute despair, screaming until his vocal cords tore, smashing furniture just a few steps away, Joan, the dutiful wife who was currently 6 months pregnant with Andrew's own child, was lying perfectly still in her bed, right in the adjacent room. The next morning, when Andrew's corpse was discovered in an unimaginably horrific state, the entire castle erupted in absolute panic. People pounded on the Queen's door to deliver the grim news. Joan slowly woke up, pulled back the silk curtains, stretched, and cast a calm, tearless gaze upon the trembling messengers. When interrogated by her ministers on how she couldn't possibly have heard a violent struggle and piercing screams right outside her door, the Queen merely gave a cold half-smile, rubbed her 6-month pregnant belly, and nonchalantly delivered a spine-chilling sentence. I was sleeping soundly. I heard absolutely nothing at all. Do you believe someone could sleep peacefully while their husband was being strangled and castrated right outside their door? Unless that person was deaf, or that person was the one who gave the order to open the door for the Grim Reaper. No one in Naples dared to produce evidence to convict Joan, but her cold smirk on that Christmas morning permanently cemented itself as the darkest urban legend of Italian royalty. The 7-year-old victim of child marriage had personally cleared the obstacle to her throne using the most brutal method possible. However, no karma is a debt that gets paid in full on the political chessboard. The child Joan carried in her womb, conceived from a forced marriage and born on the very Christmas stained with its father's blood, was snatched away by its paternal family's invading Hungarian army. That poor baby died before it could even memorize its mother's face, perishing at barely 3 years old in a foreign land. A perfect, final period, completely erasing the bloodline of a blood-soaked wedding night. Number 4. Lady Margaret Beaufort. the medical nightmare and the brutal foundation of the Tudor dynasty. If Joan of Naples was the one who actively wielded the blade to free herself from the yoke of control, then now, had we returned to foggy England to witness a crime that used no swords, involved no midnight assassination plots, yet was so barbaric and haunting that it permanently altered the flow of European history. That was the physiological devastation inflicted upon a child's body, condoned by the very greed of the royal family. In 15th century England, feudal society operated on incredibly bizarre standards. Betrothing children at 5 or 7 years old was commonplace. Families signed papers, exchanged land, and the children were called husband and wife in name only. However, no matter how cruel it got, the church and social laws of the time still maintained one final moral red line. It was strictly forbidden to force sexual intercourse, consummation of marriage, if the girl was under 14 years old. That was the absolute minimum age that rudimentary medicine of the time believed a female body could withstand the physical toll of pregnancy and childbirth. But when faced with a colossal fortune and overwhelming power, so-called morality was nothing more than a piece of scrap paper. Look at the fate of Lady Margaret Beaufort. She was the sole heiress to one of the most massive estates and landholdings in all of England at the time. More importantly, the regal royal blood of King Edward III flowed in her veins. That wealth and that bloodline were the death sentence for her childhood. When Margaret was just 12 years old, her body still frail, her chest undeveloped, her menstrual cycle likely not even begun, she caught the eye of a fiercely ambitious man, Edmund Tudor. Edmund was 24 at the time, the maternal half-brother of King Henry VI. He didn't care that Margaret was merely a child who should have been playing with dolls. He didn't need love, didn't need time to court her. The absolute only thing taking root in the mind of this grown man was this: if Margaret, who was chronically sickly, suddenly died before bearing him a child, all of that massive land would slip from his grasp and be reclaimed by the crown. He had to stamp his ownership at any cost. Greed turned Edmund into a demon disguised as a nobleman. Ignoring all advice and warnings from the clergy, defying the condemning glare of society, the 24-year-old man dragged the 12-year-old girl to bed in the very first days of their marriage. He used brute physical force to rape a child. So the cruelty didn't lie in a blade's slash, but in how he turned the incomplete, undeveloped body of a little girl into a breeding machine with a singular purpose: locking down his inheritance. The result? The 12-year-old girl got pregnant. A 12-year-old girl was horrified to realize that a life was growing inside her, crushing her internal organs within her tiny frame. Her belly grew larger day by day, agonizing back pain tormented her, while her pelvis remained that of a child who hadn't finished growing. But heaven seemingly wanted to punish the abuser. A few months after forcing his wife into pregnancy, Edmund Tudor contracted the plague. He screamed in agony and dropped dead, leaving Margaret completely alone in the freezing Pembroke Castle, and the little girl became a widow preparing to be a mother, barely after turning 13. And then the fateful day arrived. In January 1457, labor pains struck Margaret. This was not a normal birth. This was a medical nightmare, nature's most gruesome torture inflicted upon a human being. Because the little girl's pelvis was far too narrow, the fetus physically could not push its way out. The agonizing labor dragged on relentlessly, horrifyingly tearing at her soul for nearly 24 straight hours. The horrific screams, the 13-year-old girl begging to die, echoed off the freezing stone walls of Pembroke Castle. mingling with the desperate muttered prayers of the sweat-drenched midwives. In the Middle Ages, before anesthesia, before the concept of sterilization or safe C-sections, the midwives facing difficult births only had one option: brutal manual intervention. They were forced to use their bare hands, reaching deep into the tiny mother's body, pulling, twisting, using sheer brute force to rip the baby out just to save a life. The physical devastation was so catastrophic that Margaret's uterus and reproductive organs were torn to shreds, permanently damaged. Her perineum was destroyed. Blood soaked the thick layers of bedding crimson red. The 13-year-old girl lay clinging to life on the bed, her body ruined, permanently stripped of the ability to ever be a mother again in her lifetime. And yet, amidst that pool of metallic blood and death, a baby's piercing cry rang out. The child had miraculously survived. The baby dragged out from that hellish birth canal, ironically, was named Henry. Yes, it was Henry Tudor, the man who would survive the bloody wars of the Roses, seize the throne, and become the great King Henry VII. He was the architect of the most glorious Tudor dynasty in England, the father of the infamous King Henry VIII, and the great-grandfather of the mighty Queen Elizabeth I. But whenever we read lines praising the brilliance of the Tudor era, history textbooks conveniently ignore a filthy, horrifying truth: that this entire majestic, proudly ruling dynasty of England was built upon the foundation of a brutal, pedophilic rape, sprouting from the shredded, mutilated womb of a 12-year-old girl. The terrifying trauma of that birth never let Margaret go. It dug its roots into her soul, killed her innocence, and transformed her from a frail little girl into an iron-willed, ice-cold woman who would use the most ruthless political machinations to protect her son and shove him onto the throne. She dubbed herself My Lady the King's Mother, managing the royal court with an unparalleled authority that made even men tremble in fear. But deep down, beneath that impenetrable shell of supreme power, she still carried the bleeding wounds of that 12-year-old girl from years past. Nearly 50 years after that hellish childbirth, when Margaret was a white-haired queen mother, the English court was negotiating to marry her own granddaughter to King James IV of Scotland. The little princess was not yet 14. All the high lords in the council room nodded in eager agreement over the lucrative diplomatic benefits. Only one person stood up and slammed her hand on the table in furious opposition. It was Queen Mother Margaret Beaufort. She adamantly demanded that the court keep her granddaughter in England, delaying the marriage until the girl was truly of age. When the bewildered ministers questioned why she would sabotage a major national affair just over a few years of age, Margaret delivered an answer that sent a chill through the entire room, forcing everyone into bowed silence. A sentence that cut straight back into her own wound that had never healed for half a century. He will not wait. He will do her harm. There were no grand words here, no lofty political arguments. It was just the agonizing, blood-curdling scream echoing from the depths of a former victim's soul, desperately trying to stretch out her aged arms to protect another child from the very hell she was once thrown into. That warning rang out like a death knell, echoing the eternal tragedy of women trapped beneath the crushing weight of a blood-soaked crown. Number 5. Isabella of Angoulême, stealing her daughter's groom and history's most shameless excuse. In 1200, 12-year-old Isabella was brazenly snatched away by the 33-year-old King John of England, right under the nose of her fiancé, Hugh IX. The king's cruelty and depravity knew no bounds. He forced his child bride to live under the same roof as the very ex-wife he had just discarded. For 6 years of her youth, Isabella was nothing more than a political ornament, stifled by the suffocating resentment of the royal court until she was of childbearing age. In 1216, King John died, leaving Isabella a dowager queen. She used the pretext of escorting her 10-year-old daughter, Princess Joan, back to France to hand her over to her future husband. Ironically, the groom-to-be, Count Hugh X, was the son of the very man King John had robbed Isabella from 20 years prior. But the moment she laid eyes on the young, dashing groom, Isabella's royal drama queen instincts ignited. At 32, she immediately shoved her own daughter aside, usurped the role of the bride, and married the groom himself. Little 10-year-old Joan was left abandoned, forced to watch her own mother don the wedding dress and steal her man on her wedding day. See, to quell the fury of the English court, Isabella penned a masterclass in gaslighting to her son, King Henry III. I discovered he intended to break the engagement with your sister. To ensure your throne in England remained safe, I was forced to sacrifice my own aging body and marry him myself. A mother steals her daughter's husband to satisfy a younger lover, yet weeps and beats her chest, claiming she sacrificed herself for the greater good. Number 6. Isabella of France, the humiliation and talons of the she-wolf of France. In 1308, 12-year-old Princess Isabella was married to the 23-year-old King Edward II. On her wedding day, she suffered the ultimate humiliation. Her husband didn't spare her a single glance. His eyes instead locked longingly on his male favorite, Piers Gaveston. King Edward even had the audacity to snatch Isabella's wedding gifts and hand them to his lover right in front of her. The 12-year-old girl seethed, clenching her fists until they bled, yet she didn't shed a single tear. The years that followed were a psychological hell. Edward moved on to favor Hugh Despenser, a man who isolated Isabella, stripped her of her property, and tore her own children from her arms. Pushed to the brink, Isabella utilized absolute patience, playing the role of the submissive wife to perfection to lower her enemy's guard. In 1325, a naive Edward sent Isabella to France for diplomatic negotiations. The moment she landed, the lamb mask was shredded. Alongside her lover, Roger Mortimer, she recruited a battle-hardened mercenary army and invaded England. The fury of the she-wolf of France swept through everything in its path. Her enemy, Hugh Despenser, was captured, hanged, castrated, and disemboweled alive while she watched from a high platform, cold and unblinking. King Edward II was forced to abdicate and thrown into a dungeon. History grimly records that, to avenge the years of homosexual dalliances that humiliated her, Isabella ordered the king's assassination via a morbid method, a red-hot iron poker thrust through his rectum until he died. A brutal, savage revenge that turned the name she-wolf into the most terrifying death sentence for any man who dared betray her. And so, we have flipped to the final pages of the darkest chronicle, and where fairy tales are stripped bare, exposing the brutally cruel, filthy true face of European royal history. We are often taught that history is a majestic painting crafted by great sword-wielding kings, brilliant peace treaties, and magnificent castles. But behind those proud dynasties, beneath the brilliant red velvet carpets that cushion the steps of monarchs, lies the blood, the tears, and the silent screams of children whose youth was stolen. Among the sacrificial brides we just went through, whose story left you the most shocked, terrified, or speechless? Leave your comment right down below. I will be reading and discussing them with you. If you found this raw, dark journey back in time compelling enough, don't forget to hit like and share this video to support the channel. And most importantly, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because the Vault of History still holds countless terrifying mysteries, scalding drama, and terrifying dark corners that never made it into the textbooks, waiting for us to uncover in the upcoming episodes. Thank you for your courage in staying with me until these very last minutes. Goodbye, and see you next time.